We're going to start here. Good morning. Welcome back. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us now today. Really excited. We had such a great day yesterday. Wasn't it good? Wasn't it fun? Yeah? It has been so nice getting to see so many of you that we've worked with for the past few years and getting to meet a bunch of new folks, new partners in this work. If you're like me and you talked as much as I did yesterday, you may also be losing your voice. So I'm going to try to make it through my panel and then walk quietly through the halls after this. So I just want to say a quick few words before we start the panel up here. And I don't know if Chris is out there anywhere and wants to say anything. Okay, so I think just a few things. The first is, everything was really great yesterday. It was really seamless. We're hoping for another day like that. We're going to hopefully be on time this morning. I think one of the most confusing things yesterday was that we were behind and what time things were starting and ending, so we're going to do better on that. The other thing I want to put a plug for is the working groups. I know not everyone got to join those yesterday because you were called by the beautiful weather or because it took a while to get food. So today, lunch and the working group sessions are separate, so you can both enjoy your lunch inside, outside, or wherever, but then also join a working group. Even if you didn't go to one yesterday, that's no problem to join today. Most of the group spent yesterday doing some introductions and then really setting an agenda for how to talk about these topics. So, for example, I was in the date label working group and we went around, we discussed some of the concerns and ideas people had for the issue, and then we set out 4 subtopics within the topic of date labels that we're going to address today in small groups, and then set an agenda for the working group going forward. So for most of the groups, the real work of deciding things to do together and whether and how to continue to convene after the conference will happen today. So don't hesitate to join one if you didn't join yesterday. That's totally fine. So I think with that, I'm going to ask my panelists for this morning plenary to come up and join me on the stage. And I'm really excited to have a discussion with different perspectives from both within the U.S. and globally on policy and the ways that we're thinking about the engagement with government and then private sector. So I'm going to move over here. All right. So let me just quickly introduce the panelists, and then we're going to really do this as a discussion. So I will ask each of them a little bit of background questions so they can tell you about what they do and some of the things that they're doing that they're most excited about. And then I'll ask a few questions for them to discuss, but we will also have time for any of your questions as well. So I think I'll give you a little bit of a heads up before that, but we will have time for the audience to be engaged. So just going from immediately to my right and down the line, we have Commissioner Kathryn Garcia, who's with the City of New York Department of Sanitation. So we're excited. She's sort of representing not only New York, but just the local perspective and what it looks like to try to deal with these things, not just in any city, but in one of the biggest cities. So next to her, we have Representative Hannah Kane, who is from our state of Massachusetts and has been very involved in introducing legislation here in Massachusetts on issues around food waste and also in food systems more generally in the Mass Food Policy Council. After her is Kelliann Blazek, who is counsel for Representative Chellie Pingree of Maine and is really running all of the food and ag work, and particularly the Food Recovery Act and food waste legislation. And then at the end, we have Nicola Hopley, who is with the Department for Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs from the United Kingdom. So bringing another perspective, another approach, and talking about what they're doing. So you'll notice we have a mix of both different levels of government, but also both Kelliann and Hannah represent the legislature, and then the others represent more of an agency perspective. So we'll get to talk a little bit about what it looks like trying to make these decisions based on what level of government you're at, but also based on where in government you reside and what the role is of that branch of government. I guess to start, I'm going to ask Kathryn to talk a little bit about just, your background, what New York City's been doing. We actually brought up New York City a few times yesterday as being an example, starting curbside composting in the biggest city, rolling that out, expanding that, and having some zero waste goals. So if you can just take some time, tell us about, what you want people to know about what you're doing and how you've decided to start those programs.
Certainly. So I joined the department in 2014 after the snow season. So while you may think that I am primarily the largest sanitation department in the world, no, really, I'm a snow organization, and my salt contracts are out to bid right this second. But really, when I got into this role, it was really trying to think differently about what we could do with solid waste. The city has been at the forefront of really thinking about the impact of the environment back to the Plan YC days of 2007, and where were we going to take it, and where was solid waste going to go, and how are we going to get there? And some of it's very basic. You look at the waste characterization for the city of New York, and if I had absolutely perfect recyclers for the traditional metal, glass, plastic cartons, I'm only going to get to about 33%. The next big slice of that pie is yard waste and food. And in New York City, because we are so dense compared to other cities, it's a lot of food. And it is a lot of compostable paper. And so that has been at the heart of what we have been working on. But one of the other things that's different in New York City is that we are bifurcated. I take care of the residential side, and I regulate the commercial side. And so also moving the commercial side to more of a zero waste future has been part of what we've really been focused on. None of it, as I'm sure that you heard yesterday, is easy to get done. But one of the things at the local levels, if you decide that you really want to do it, you have the power to actually start moving it and getting it done. So it's not like I send the trucks out in the morning. So I get to decide how many of them are going to go and what they're going to do. And so that is the power of being local. But there are lots of things I'd like folks who are at different levels of government to be working on. So we're really excited in New York City about where we are and where we're going. We are serving about 3.5 million New Yorkers at the curb at this point in time. And so we are continuing to work on fine-tuning that program and making changes and making it more efficient. We are expanding the number of businesses that are required to separate their commercial waste. So we added another 1,700 businesses to the first 300 or so that were part of that program. We are beginning to see investments regionally in more composting or anaerobic digester infrastructure, which is, as someone from one of the environmental groups is like, I want you to go fast, but not too fast. And we're also seeing a lot of grassroots efforts. There's much more conversation across the board about what's happening in food waste, which is helping me as we move forward with all of our programs, whether it's now the current best restaurant in the world, Massimo, and his desire to reduce food waste in his cookbook on how to do that. I will never cook as well as he will, but really people thinking about it in all different levels of whether or not they're in food service, whether or not they're farmers, whether or not they are consumers, and how that impacts the planet and where we're going from here. And particularly because food and yard waste are the biggest sources of greenhouse gases within the waste pie that goes to landfills, it really is very important. And New York City knows firsthand what it's like when hurricanes, which are actually just superstorms, turn inland and make a mighty left turn. So we know that we need to be prepared, and we need to be doing our part to change that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Hannah, talking about, from your perspective, what has brought you to be interested in food and food waste, and a little bit about some of the legislation you're working on and why that was of interest.
Sure. So I actually grew up in Maine, where Representative Pingree represents, and I grew up on a dirt road and had both sets of my grandparents that lived in the same town, and they were products of the Depression. And one of my grandparents had about a football field-sized garden, and they basically grew everything that they ate, and then they composted. And they really sort of taught me a lot about the responsibility of ensuring that you're doing what you can for the planet. I didn't know this when I was young, that this would be something that would sort of come back later in life to me. I thought it was just sort of life lessons from grandparents. But throughout my life, I really sort of took to heart not only the lessons that they taught me, but where I thought I could make a difference. So, I'm a graduate from Boston University School of Management. I come at this from a little bit different perspective. My degree was in marketing, and so I was saying earlier to Kathryn that I'm probably the least educated person in this room from a policy perspective on a lot of this stuff. But what I view the opportunity for me is to help move things across and get them to the finish line. There's a lot of good ideas that exist out there, but in Massachusetts alone, we operate on 2-year legislative cycles, and we have about 6,000 bills that get filed every legislative cycle, and about 4 to 5% of those bills will go all the way through the process. So some of your job is to sort of continually have progress each session, even if you can't get something all the way across the line, to have progress on it. And part of my job is to be smart about how to have the things that I care about show up in a way that can induce other people to care about it. And so sometimes that's recognizing what's the best message to have. Why I'm involved in this may not be the best selling point for someone else who I need to help move this bill along that I'm looking to do. So one of the ways that I make sure I do that as well is to sit on different groups out there in which a lot of this is being discussed. So as Emily mentioned, I'm a member of the Mass Food Policy Council. I'm one of the 17 members, and I go to all of those meetings because I learn a lot and I figure out where are some of the roadblocks and where are some of the ways that I can weigh in and sort of move things ahead. So we've held things at the State House. We've had some briefing days on some of the bills that I have filed and others have filed, really to get people interested in it. And I think one of the things that's unique about food waste, and I really pair that with food insecurity, which is really how I got drawn into this process, is that there is no area that is void of having this as an issue. It doesn't discriminate, right? So no matter where you live, there are people who are challenged with food insecurity, and food waste is an issue. But it also cuts across sort of economic issues and environmental issues. So you have good opportunity to have lots of different conversations with people about where they may be more interested in something. And so having some of the days that we've had at the State House to bring people in and make sure their staffs are aware of these issues, and then matching that up with opportunities from a legislative perspective. So in this last legislative session, I partnered with a Democratic colleague of mine, a senator from Lowell, who's actually now left to be the city manager of Lowell. And she and I filed legislation that her office had worked on. And I went to her and I said, you're filing that in the Senate, which is great, but what if I file it in the House too? Because we have sort of twice the opportunity of getting these bills moved forward. So we did that. And because it was bipartisan, I'm a Republican, she's a Democrat, it's another way that you can sort of intrigue people into wanting to understand why are you working on this together. And she and I had done some work as members of Women in Government as well. And so we had also relied on some of the conversations that we've had with some of our legislative partners across the country. So 2 of the bills that I filed this session, one has to do with food donations. And part of that is extending the civil liability protections that don't exist for a lot of the groups that are out there. And another was to give a tax deduction to farmers so that they would be incentivized to basically take crops that they would have otherwise just left in the field or not taken to market because they sort of knew that they were taking the best of what they had and they wouldn't sell above a certain amount, but they had grown more than that. And again, giving them a reason to want to actually bring those crops in and donate them. And so that bill is actually still moving. Our session ends July 31st in Massachusetts, our formal session. That bill is in our House Ways and Means right now, and I'm somewhat hopeful that we're going to be able to get it across the threshold. One of the reasons I'm somewhat hopeful is because the vice chair of House Ways and Means is also in the Mass Food Policy Council with me, and he is retiring after this year after having served for 25 years. So literally every day I'm saying to him, hey, this is going to be a great legacy bill if we can just get this across the... The other bill that I filed, and Senator Donahue filed, has to do with the date labeling. And very appreciative of the work that's going on the federal level on it, but part of what we were trying to do was to eliminate the confusion that exists out there in the marketplace. And I know you guys have talked about this all day long, and all yesterday there was the piece on it. But again, I take this back to my own house, right? My husband thinks any sort of date on anything is just mere guidance and to be ignored, and he'll eat anything at any time. I take it as if, it's a proclamation from God telling you, do not eat this after this date. And we get into these discussions about which is right. And that sort of rose from this part that if we're having these discussions, who else is having these discussions? And then what is happening? And I'm also a big supporter of our local food banks and raise a lot of money for them through charitable efforts. And they have the same issues relative to not being able to use some of the food that they would like to be able to use. Again, from my perspective, I sit here in awe of everything that you all bring to the table, and I sort of see my opportunity and my job to help find ways to get these great ideas over the finish line to make them become law.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for the work that you're doing. So next, Kelliann, I think we're going to start really quickly. So Kelliann will be speaking both from her own knowledge and experience, but also, representing Representative Pingree. So because Representative Pingree can't be here, we have a video. So we're going to show this video really quick, and then we'll have Kelly. Do you want to say a little bit about the video?
Yeah, I was just going to start by saying that, so I work as an attorney for Chellie Pingree, and she would love to have been here, but unfortunately there are votes right now on big ticket items like immigration and other things in DC that you may have heard about. So she sends her best wishes, but for context for this video, Chellie and a representative, David Young from Iowa, just started a House Food Waste Caucus, and so both of them wanted to share their regards together.
All right, so while we're getting the video up again, I don't know, Kelliann, if you want to start
I'm
speaking a
happy
little
to.
bit, and then we can show the video.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Congresswoman Chellie Pingree represents the 1st District of Maine, and we're happy to have a fellow Mainer here. 1st District of Maine is the southern portion of Maine. She's been in the House of Representatives since 2008. She's a farmer herself. She's been organic farming since the 1970s. And I started in her office about 2.5 years ago, so I actually started the month after she introduced the Food Recovery Act. So my predecessor actually drafted and wrote the bill and kind of passed it off to me. So it was an exciting time. I'm actually a product of the Food Law and Policy Clinic here, so I worked here after law school, and that's where I really started to learn about food waste. So it was really helpful to have that background, obviously, going to Chellie's office and kind of being passed this, the first comprehensive federal food waste legislation bill, and having to run with it. And in my first few months of working for Chellie, I think I took nearly 100 meetings just on food waste. So everyone was kind of using our office as a hub for food waste because they didn't have anywhere to go at the federal level in terms of on the Hill. And so it was a really exciting time. One of my first kind of responsibilities was to figure out in the Food Recovery Act, which is so comprehensive, like which pieces are the most politically viable, which pieces are the most exciting to constituents and stakeholders. So we actually pulled out the date labeling pieces, and Hannah mentioned state date labeling legislation. So we introduced a food date labeling act at the federal level, which would provide a national standard to standardize date labels. So that was first introduced in 2016, and we're actually working right now to revise it and reintroduce it in this Congress. So that's something that you all can help with. We have a draft. We're looking for feedback. If you're involved in the date labeling discussion, we'd love to chat with you and hear your thoughts. We're looking for companies to provide feedback based on being manufacturers themselves and whether that would work for them. So it definitely mimics the voluntary standard that the industry has put forth. So that's kind of two pieces of legislation we're working on. There's been a lot happening on the Hill, honestly, in the last few years, so it's been exciting to have that momentum. I was writing a list of things related to food waste that have happened, and it kind of got me reinvigorated and excited about it because there has been a lot of movement, not necessarily legislation passed, but other members of Congress have introduced bills. House Ag Committee had a hearing on food waste a few years ago. We've held numerous briefings just to educate staff about food waste. We've had stakeholders come in and lobby us and other members on food waste.
I'm Congresswoman.
She always interrupts me. I'm just kidding. We've had the Farm Bill is going on, as you know, right now. The Senate is voting on it. Amendments starting today, probably final vote tomorrow or Friday. The first food waste provisions are in the Farm Bill. This year, we just started a House Food Waste Caucus, so there is a lot of momentum, but we really need your support and help and guidance in moving forward. And so ready? Yep. Video is ready, so we're gonna pass it off to Chellie and David Young.
Chellie Pingree of Maine.
And I'm Congressman David Young of Iowa. As co-founders of the bipartisan House Food Waste Caucus, it's our pleasure to offer our greetings for the 2018 U.S. Food Waste Summit. So thank you to the Harvard Law School Center for Health, Law, and Policy Innovation for hosting this important event, and to all of you for your work in food recovery and food waste prevention.
Since you're the experts on the issue, we don't need to rehash all the problems that food waste causes in our country. But we do want to let you know that the staggering amount of unnecessary food waste our country produces, as well as its great economic and environmental costs, is not lost on us.
Nor is the incredible opportunity before us. Reducing food waste is a chance to boost family budgets, strengthen farms and other businesses, generate sustainable energy, and get perfectly good food to the people who need it. So Republican, Democrat, or otherwise, we believe reducing food waste is something we can all get behind.
That's why we launched the House Food Waste Caucus in April. Our goals are to look at ways to promote food waste reduction across the food supply chain, to provide educational opportunities to our colleagues, and support efforts to reduce food waste at federal agencies, including the USDA and EPA.
We're happy to report that those conversations have already begun. So just last month, we both participated in a food waste roundtable with USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue to hear the agency's stance on food waste and offer our suggestions. The caucus also plans to collaborate with diverse stakeholders to highlight food waste success stories across the country, and that's where you come in.
The best solutions to our country's problem don't come from Washington, but come from communities across the country, and that's absolutely true with food waste. As leaders on this issue, you're writing the food waste success stories and solutions that we hope to bring back to Washington.
So thank you for all your good work. Keep it up, and please keep us posted.
Take care.
So Hannah mentioned how bipartisan this issue is, and that's something we are very intentional about. We work across the aisle all the time. Food policy is kind of one of the interesting issues in Congress at many levels, because it's not normally a party line issue. It's really based on where you're from, what your district looks like. So oftentimes, we'll work a lot with a Republican from Washington State because his agriculture looks like our agriculture in Maine. And so food waste kind of is along those lines. It's something that everyone can relate to, no matter where you are in the country. And so keeping it bipartisan is really important to us. And so frequently when I hear from stakeholders that they'll say, oh, well, my member doesn't care about food. My member doesn't care about food waste. I think everyone has a success story to share with their member, and it's really important to be persistent and invite them to your projects, your composting facilities, your food bank, because they do listen and it does make a difference. A lot of our ideas in the federal legislation we introduced actually bubbled up from the ground because Maine is such a interesting place food-wise that we learned a lot from constituents and stakeholders. So it is really important for you to continue sharing your stories.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And so finally, hearing a little bit from Nicola about the experience internationally. So I think the UK, there's certain things that you're doing that are facing the same challenges we are, but in some ways has been ahead on looking at this issue at the national level. So I'd love to hear a little bit, if you can tell people what you do, what you've been excited about, and anything else that's helpful.
Will do. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Nicola Hopley. I work in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. I'm the team leader for a small team that work on food waste issues. But we also work very closely with our delivery partner, the Waste and Resources Action Programme, which some of you may have heard of. It's called WRAP for short. And DEFRA funds WRAP to take forward a lot of our work on food waste in the UK, and they're increasingly acting also globally. So a little bit of background on what we have been doing in the UK. It all really started back in 2007 when we commissioned WRAP to undertake the first analysis of food waste in our homes in the UK. And that research was the first time that we really understood the level of food waste that was happening in our homes, why it was happening. So householders were asked to fill in diaries. And there was also an examination of bins. And through that research, we understood more accurately about what food waste could have been avoided and how much it was costing householders. And at that point, so this is back in 2007, the UK was wasting 8 million tonnes in our homes, so a real significant amount of food, and a lot of that could have been avoided. And there were 5 key reasons that were identified at that point for food waste in homes. That was lack of meal planning, confusion over date labels, interesting similar issues in the UK and the US, preparing too much in the home, so understanding about portion sizes, and also confusion about how to use leftovers. What can you use? How do you store it? So similar to date labels, a concern about food safety. So a real education piece. So at that point, the UK government worked with WRAP to develop our food waste campaign called Love Food, Hate Waste. And that gave messages to try and help householders to manage their food, to understand date labels, to understand how to store food more effectively, to make sure it lasted. And that had a real immediate benefit, and we saw significant reductions in food waste in homes. We've now reduced by 12% total food waste in homes, and avoidable food waste is more like a 20% reduction. But we also wanted to see a reduction in food waste from businesses. So we worked with WRAP to develop new voluntary initiatives. You may have heard of them. They were called the Quartile Commitment. And we've had 3 phases of that Quartile Commitment running since 2005 to 2015. And the way that worked was signatories signed up to take action on food waste within their businesses. So we had all our retailers signed up, lots of food manufacturers, and we also had an agreement with our hospitality and food sector businesses. And through those initiatives, businesses would come together, share experiences, and go out and take action to reduce food waste. So by 2015, we've reduced our total food waste, so in homes, businesses, all food waste, this is post-farm gate, by 14% per capita and a 19% reduction in avoidable food waste. So we're very proud of the success we've had through that approach, but clearly there is much more to do. So in 2016, we launched our most recent voluntary agreement called the Quartile 2025 Agreement. Clues in its name, it's a 10-year agreement running till 2025. And we've set ourselves a really challenging target of a 20% reduction, in addition to those reductions I've just explained, to a further 20% by 2025 per capita. And if we achieve that, that will put us on a path to achieving 12.3 SDG goal of a 50% reduction in retail and households. So this latest agreement takes a lot of the experience from the earlier ones. It's based on sector-level collaboration, which we think is a really important means of unlocking barriers to action within supply chains. Businesses working within a sector can share experiences, identify best practice, and then that best practice can be cascaded across whole industries, so beyond the immediate signatory base to the agreement. We're also taking a new approach, a more focused approach to addressing food waste in homes. So building on the previous work of Love Food, Hate Waste, we're now identifying the people in the UK who are wasting the most. We're finding there are people in cities, certain age groups, and we're targeting those, and also focusing on the products that are most wasted, which in the UK are potatoes, bread, milk, poultry. So we're really targeting advice tailored to those goods.
That's so helpful. So I think, there's a lot we can take from that. So I want to just ask a few questions, and I'll target them to a few of you in particular, and then we'll obviously have some time for the audience. I think the first was a couple of the discussions mentioned a little bit what you can do at your level of government and what others can do. So I think just for Kathryn, Hannah, and Kelliann, just to say a few words each about challenges that you think aren't able to be addressed at your level of government, and how you would like to be able to partner with other levels, or what you'd like to see them doing to complement what you're attempting to do. So maybe a specific example if you know.
Well, certainly. I mean, I think that for anyone who's working at the local level, having any sort of state or federal action would be helpful, in part because one of the things we're doing is growing markets for the end use of the waste. And growing markets, if you're a locality, even if you're an extraordinarily large locality, could use some support. So the more that the policy is pushed at a federal or a state level, the more that investors will be willing to open that next compost facility, that next digester facility. I liked your tagline. My tagline for my food waste fair was make food, not waste. Because I think that once people actually start separating out their food waste, one of the things they find is they're really sort of horrified by how much they're wasting due to lack of planning, due to confusion about what to do with leftovers, due to confusion around how to cook for a certain number of people. But they all suddenly step back and say, wow, I just threw 50% of my grocery budget into a bin. So I really think that at the state and at the federal level, I would love to see things like dates. My children will not eat things that, even canned goods, that are beyond the date on the can. They'll start pulling it out and thinking that I'm about to poison them. I think it's all just fine. They're fine. But also just sort of incentivizing and saying it's important. So here's the thing that crosses over that you probably wouldn't think about, is that if the highway departments used compost instead of silt fencing, we would have another market. That's sort of what I'm trying to think about in terms of what states can do. If they could put that into their procurements, that would give me a whole new market. It's true in Pennsylvania. It's not true in New York State. It's not true in Massachusetts, I don't think. So there are a lot of opportunities, I think, at the state and federal level to really be pressing this. Obviously, for New York City, the farm issue isn't so much. We feel bad about the fact that they throw away too much. It just impacts the cost of food for New York City residents, many of whom are food insecure. So we do a lot of trying to connect the food bank world with where there is leftover food, and obviously there's a huge amount of leftover food in the city of New York, both commercially and in residences.
I think that the date labeling is a great opportunity to do something on the federal level. I mean, the conversations that I've had with the grocery manufacturers, they're concerned that all 50 states could have all different labeling requirements, and what does that mean for them? And I understand that. Again, and I tell them from a business viewpoint, I understand that. But at some point, we need forward momentum. And right now we have some pretty strict labeling laws, and they're not being effective, in my opinion, here. So we need to change how it is that we're looking at it. So I'm fully supportive of this being dealt with on a federal level and being something that is bought into by the other states. And I have told the grocery manufacturers when they come to meet with me, I'm fully willing to do whatever I can to help on the federal level, to see where it is that we can get additional support, because I think that's great. But we also just can't sit by and wait another 10 years, because I think about the fact of, the opportunity loss, both for people who are food insecure, and then the amount of food that's going into, from a solid waste perspective. And so I feel that time is precious. I do also think that, one of the challenges that I see is, I think in today's world, people can have really good intentions around being thoughtful about how much food they're buying, but we live in a time where schedules change instantly. And so I think a lot of people struggle with sort of how do I be a good citizen around this? I struggled with it because on Saturday I can go shopping for the week and plan on my meals, and then my schedule can change, or my husband's schedule changes. And I have a senior and a junior and a seventh grader, and they're pretty good about cooking things, but they can't do all things that supplant us. And so I made a decision 2 years ago that for 2 nights a week, I order from a food service, because I think I'm not gonna have any food waste, because I'm planning, no matter who gets home at what time, this is the appropriate amount of food for the family, and it's not gonna go to waste, because we all need to eat. It becomes more of an issue of the preparation of food that becomes a challenge, in the household. And I really struggled with it a little bit, because I'm thinking, I don't necessarily know that this food is being bought local, which is something that I try and support as much as possible. It comes in a cardboard box, so now I'm creating something else that needs to be recycled. But I think that, part of what we can do is things legislatively or rules and regs, and then part of what we can do is also be out there and be present in talking about these issues. And not talking about them just in rooms where people care about them, like we are this morning, talking about them out there in other opportunities where it may have been sort of the furthest thing on someone's mind, and yet you can make an impact by the information you can relay to them on how to make small changes in their own world and be supportive of not only the local food economy, which again is a big priority for me, but also in terms of understanding the food waste piece. Because I think people feel bad when they throw something away in their own home. I don't think they understand the magnitude of what that looks like when you scale it up, whether community level, state level, or federal level. And so that's, I think, a real opportunity for us to do something on the educational side of things.
Yeah, I fully agree that we should be proactive about addressing the date labeling issue, which I do see as, the federal government having a role in, and providing a national standard is something that we should be doing. And, keyword is proactive. I think, let's think about recent labeling issues that created a patchwork, potentially starting in Vermont. GMOs is what I'm talking about, and we're going to have another GMO type issue where we have a bunch of state laws. We're rushing before the first state law is implemented to get a national standard. We have an opportunity right now to be proactive and create a national standard before we have that issue. So I think that's something that we're really pushing on the federal side. And anything else. In terms of other things that I think is the role of the federal government, I think anything like research and data collection is something that we're good at, and we're really pushing to keep funding going to EPA and USDA so that they're able to do those things. And then the other thing is, and it's something that Elise Golan, I know you're here somewhere, mentioned in our federal policy panel yesterday, but federal agency coordination. Elise mentioned yesterday that that's one of Secretary Perdue's kind of next steps, is to make sure that, the obvious agencies like USDA, EPA, and FDA aren't the only ones working on this issue, but that we're coordinating with, for example, I think a great example is Department of Defense. Think about every military base, not just in the US, but worldwide. All the food, both that's produced, and catered and consumed on the base, either in the Anthony's Pizzas that are third-party restaurants that are on the base, or in their own cafeterias. Like, that's a huge opportunity if we start looking at institutions that are federally funded, and how, if they're composting, donating food. So I think that's another piece that has to be done at the federal level. We need to start talking to other agencies and figuring out how we can coordinate all together.
So, and I think it's great. What's so exciting, and I think, we all know this because the past few days we've been here together, there's so much energy. Each of the three of you scratched the tip of the iceberg of what the potential is, both at your own level, but then at other levels of government, to really not only clear the way for innovation in businesses, in new entrepreneurial endeavors, nonprofits, but also to provide support for those. So, if we know that there's a lot of waste in the household and confusion, let's get rid of some of that confusion. So I think it shows how much energy there is. And I think everyone touched a little bit on a lot of the movement that's been happening the last few years, which has really been a theme of this conference as well, just having many people coming back 2 years after our first conference and seeing there's so much change, there's so many more states looking at these things, there's more going on at the local level. I want to talk a little bit about, I think both for Kathryn and Nicola, about some of the setback that you faced, or something that you, in moving full steam ahead with some of these changes, what was a learning or something that you had to change direction on? I don't know, if either of you want to take that first.
Well, being on the front lines of trying to operationalize at a very large scale in a very dense city obviously has a number of challenges. Some of them are just people don't like to touch food waste. And so when we initially rolled out the program, we said, just throw your leftovers in the brown bin. They don't like to clean their brown bins. So we had to accept that they would line them with plastic, that we would allow clear bags. And so we have been able to overcome that with technology that has really been sort of taking off, whether or not that's the Tiger or the Scotch Turbo or the Core system. But it also has meant sort of a community that's beyond this room. This doesn't work unless I get the people who are in the garbage business to actually be willing to manage food as well, because otherwise I can't get to scale. The community compost gardens and all that we do at the local level, and some of them are quite large and very successful, are key to the educational component of this. But I'm moving 12,000 tons a day out of New York City, whether or not that's recyclables, waste, or compost. And that is just, it's not going to happen with somebody on a bicycle. And I hate to blow anyone's bubble, but so it's like making sure that we're having the conversations with the folks who are going to transfer it, who are then having the conversations with the folks who are going to handle it, because residential compost is not going to look like what the folks who probably are in this room, what their compost looks like. And then when you expand it to public schools, it is not going to even look like what the residential compost looks like. We like to think children are just angelic in this, but no, they're not really focused on it. They will throw their pretzel bags out with everything else. They are my worst contamination.
Those little monsters.
They're little, yeah, well, actually, I think the teenagers my high schools are more challenging than my elementary schools. But I think we have to be practical if you're going to scale with what levels of contamination are going to be on what you're asking the public to do. It will be easier in areas that are less dense, but where you have significant space constraints, you have to be accommodating of that if you want to be successful. And then it's just, how are you redesigning routes? What is the equipment that you're using to collect this? All of that has been constant changing with each district individually. So, I think that we also need to be broadening the conversation and bringing in the traditional folks who have managed this material as refuse forever and getting their mindsets changed about how we can move forward. But I do think that that's my sort of negative thing, but I do think that the conversation's totally different than it was 2 years ago. It was really sort of very, very small, sort of on the fringe, and now it's really moving, I think, much more quickly into the mainstream. We're getting folks to do it who, I would say would have resisted forever, but actually really like the fact that their regular black bag is either non-existent or totally dry, and has, unless you have a baby in the house and their diapers, there's not a lot left that doesn't have a place to go. And so they're really quite astonished. So every person I get to start it becomes sort of the next person who's getting very close to zero waste in the city of New York.
Do you want to say anything? Just about any setback or something you learned in this journey that has changed direction?
Yeah, I touched on it a bit in my introduction, but I think one area where we've really changed direction recently is on consumer food waste in homes. So we had this broad brush general advice that went out to everybody. We didn't try and tailor those messages. We just got them out. You could save £60 per month if you stopped wasting food. And then in the last few years, we found that the reductions had plateaued. So we'd clearly got that low-hanging fruit, made people change their behaviours initially. But to get the real next stage of reductions, we had to go back to the drawing board and really try and understand behaviours in the home. And what we found was that there's a real gap between people's awareness of what they're wasting in the home in reality and what they think they're doing. And when we asked people, 60% of people asked in a survey said, oh no, I don't waste food. No food waste in my home. But we know that everyone is wasting food in their homes. It just goes unnoticed. It's just a thing that happens in your kitchen, end of the day. And unless you're measuring it, and who's measuring it in their own home, you don't really understand that that's happening. So that's what we're doing now, this more tailored messaging. We now know what the key wasted products are, and we're really focusing our messaging around chicken, bread, milk, and seeing if that has an impact, and hopefully it will.
That's great, and I'll say a shout out to Ronnie Neff, who found similar things here in the U.S. that the food waste is happening in everyone's homes but our own. So, and I think businesses will say the same. We often talk to food service in different capacities, and they'll say, "Well, we know people are wasting, but it's not us," and it's happening everywhere. So, I think that's really helpful. I think especially how far you've gone with the household level. I think we have a lot to learn about. We're at the place now with Save the Food campaign and things like that, getting information into people's homes, but I think the level of knowledge you have of exactly what products and exactly where is something that we can take inspiration from. I have 8 million more questions, but I want to give some time for audience questions. So if there aren't a lot, I'll keep going, but let's start getting mics out there, and if people have questions, please let us know. So how about right over here?
I love the idea that there could be bipartisan support for these issues, but at the national level, it's really hard to believe. And you mentioned the Farm Bill. I mean, part of our big issue about food waste is diverting that food waste to people who need it. And yet, at one point in the Farm Bill, and I'd be interested to know if it's still there was a provision to push people to have to work to get food stamps. So, it's great that there's something about food waste in the Farm Bill, but if then we're giving the message that single moms with 2 kids who aren't trained to work have to go into the workforce when the unemployment rate is virtually, sort of as low as it can be. It just seems to me that you can say bipartisan support, but the reality is right now in Washington, the president's agenda wins out, and it's hard to believe that he's really about feeding people.
So I completely agree with you, but I do think there's hope. So you mentioned the work requirements in SNAP, which is in the House Farm Bill, which passed last week. So just a little brief recap of what's happened with the Farm Bill over the last few months. So the House took up the Farm Bill. It's a partisan bill, so Democrats were not involved in writing the House Farm Bill. There's work requirements and other changes to SNAP that would result in people being kicked off. So that's how the SNAP, negotiations broke down. So the Farm Bill failed on the House floor last month by a few votes. They brought it up again last week, and it actually passed. The hopeful thing is that there still is bipartisanship in the Farm Bill in the Senate version. So Chairman Roberts and Ranking Member Stabenow on the Senate side wrote a very good bipartisan bill that includes multiple food waste provisions, as well as maintain SNAP, no work requirements. And so that's actually being voted on today and tomorrow and potentially Friday as well. So yes, there are some issues, but I think Republicans and Democrats alike understand the value of food waste, and it's definitely not an either or. I think a lot of people early on in the conversation on the Hill were worried that, for example, we would take a food waste win in the Farm Bill and jeopardize SNAP, and that's definitely not happening. I think some of the biggest food waste champions, such as my boss and Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, Representative Fudge, we're not going to jeopardize our policy positions on nutrition and other food programs to get a food waste win. So we see these as really working together and very integral, and you can't take one piece out. So that's definitely recognized in the Senate Farm Bill, which is hopefully what the end product will look like. But after the Senate Farm Bill passes the Senate floor this week, then we go to conference committee, and nobody really knows what's going to happen there because you kind of have a 3 against 1. You have Ranking Member Peterson on the House side, Roberts and Stabenow all agreeing that we shouldn't have work requirements in SNAP. And so the calculation is tough right now. We're not really sure what's going to happen, and it's an election year, so that's also a factor. So your guess is as good as mine. But I definitely agree with you, and I think thanking senators right now for writing a bipartisan farm bill is really important. They need to know that, what you're thinking and whether you agree with the House Farm Bill or Senate Farm Bill. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to your members about that.
Just as a quick follow-up, I don't know, briefly, if you could say a few things that are potentially in the Farm Bill that relate to food waste. I know you mentioned a couple yesterday on a breakout, but I think there's, we were really excited to see both in the House and Senate version, definitely more so in the Senate version, there are a lot of provisions that are talking about some of the things we talked about today. So I don't know if you want to highlight one or two.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the House Farm Bill, there's just one food waste provision that would create a food waste liaison at USDA. So that person would help with guidance and technical assistance and kind of liaise with other federal agencies. So that's something we were definitely pushing. That provision is not in the Senate Farm Bill in its current form, but I think there's amendments in the works to get that in during the markup on the floor this week. And then currently in the Senate Farm Bill, there's a new milk donation program that would provide funds to dairy organizations that are trying to get some of the surplus milk that we're dealing with, especially in the Northeast and the Midwest, to nonprofit food banks, et cetera. There's money for research in the Specialty Crops program, and so that would help with like researching shelf life and how to extend shelf life on certain products. One of my boss's big pet issues is local food and local regional food systems, and we had a kind of a comprehensive bill looking at how we can move the conversation forward on local foods, and we suggested a new program that would combine a few other programs. So value-added producer grants, local food promotion program, we suggested combining those into kind of like a one-stop hub for local food. And as part of that, we suggest adding food waste as a component of that so that farmers and other nonprofits could look at food waste at the farm level and receive grant funding for it. And then the other big one is pilot project money, substantial money for pilot projects around composting and other food waste reduction plans at the local and state level. So states would get funds, I think it's up to 10 states or more than 10 states that would get funding if they're working on a composting plan, food waste reduction plan. So that's another way that the federal government can incentivize. I don't think the federal government's role would ever be, if you look at the carrot and the stick, I don't think we're ever going to be the stick and have an organic waste ban, but we can definitely incentivize good things happening at the local and state level. So we suggested something similar in the Food Recovery Act, and we were really glad that our Senate colleagues found value in kind of pushing local and state governments to be looking at food waste reduction plans.
Yeah, of course.
Just speaking to two elements of it. So Congressman McGovern is my congressman out where I represent, and we work closely on some of these issues that we both care about, in particular sort of the SNAP, and here at the state level, the Healthy Incentives Program is something that I have been one of the champions of at the State House and getting increased funding for, which gives people who receive SNAP benefits for every dollar they spend at either a farmer's market or a local farm, for every dollar they spend on fruit and vegetable, they get the dollar back, basically right back into their benefits. And it's in a way basically to help encourage healthier eating, trying new foods, and it's been really successful. And so now we're trying to get some increased funding for it. But to the point about bipartisanship or partisanship, depending on how you look at it, I think it's really important for people to not fall into the trap of viewing things simply through a partisan perspective. I think it's part of what is challenging for those of us that work on a day-to-day basis with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. It becomes really easy to politicize things and just talk about it being as either a Republican or a Democratic issue, when the reality is that, as I sort of call it, the majority of people are actually trying to work on things, and sometimes you have a little bit of a different perspective on it. But when you see things that are happening, I would encourage you to also celebrate those things regardless of what party did it. Because the only way we can stop this is if we change the dynamic. And part of that is up to each of us who's out there working on these issues. And so, if there's somebody who's a Republican who's done something that you didn't think they would do but is very supportive of the work we're doing, don't go to them saying, thank you as a Republican for doing this. because they didn't do it as a Republican. They did it as an individual who felt strongly about something and being the right thing to do. So I actually encourage people a lot of times to take out the labels of where we sit and who we are, because I'm assuming it's the same for you. I don't walk around the State House and look at people as an R or a D. None of my colleagues do. We look at each other with, what do you work on that I could partner with you on? And what do you work on that I could partner with you on? And I'm not going to work on anything with you because you're not nice. And so I'm just not going to be part of that. And so how it gets relayed to all of us out there is on a partisan perspective. But I think we can help change that dynamic and actually just thank people for doing what they're doing based on the fact that from whatever they came to from their experience in their districts, and they made a decision to do something, and that can sort of help break up that partisan view by which we sort of unfortunately look at everything these days.
Thank you. I'm so glad you said that. I think you're here. I think it's so important to remember, too, that people who are in government are choosing to be in service and want to do the right thing, and it's really important for us to communicate and celebrate those things. And you can tell us who the not nice people are later, so we can.
You probably know.
So we have a question up here. I actually would love if we could, with our mics, try to get a few questions, maybe like 2 or 3 at once, and then we can answer them all to get a few more questions out there. So there's a test if you want to go first in the back, and then Kyla can get Ashley up here. Yeah.
So I want to thank Commissioner Garcia for pointing out that there's a substantial need for investment in industrial-sized organic recovery infrastructure. And I think as we work through some of the ReFed report and subsequent efforts, I'd like to just sort of put a number out there that suggests that there's somewhere between $3 and $5 billion of investment that's necessary in infrastructure to accomplish the goals, either those of ReFed, those of the USDA, EPA, or heaven forbid, those of California by itself. And I'd like to hear some comments from you all about how we can, from a policy perspective, make this an investable space that's attractive to private sector money, that doesn't invest in feel-good stuff. It invests in things that it thinks it can make more money off of.
Let's grab 3 questions up, because that way we'll run out of time, but you can respond first to that. So Ashley, and then up here, Tess, if you can get Tom up here after. Yeah.
Thanks. Ashley Zanoli, Oregon DEQ. And building on JD's comment, I was hoping Nicola could talk about what you mean by reduce. I think in the US, we typically talk about reduce as reduce from food waste going to landfills, and not edible, avoidable food that's also being disposed to compost and AD. And we're working on some of that data in Oregon. We've found that about 2/3 of all food disposed to trash and compost is edible food that could have fed people. And as a follow-up to that, others are working on zero waste plants and infrastructure. So how can we design infrastructure that doesn't incentivize the disposal of edible food and generate goals that are maybe more rigorous than zero waste goals that count prevention, donation, and composting edible food as equal?
Perfect, thank you. And then one last, and then we'll kind of respond to all of them. Yeah.
Hi, Tom O'Donnell with EPA. Nicola, thank you for being here. Could you please, if you have a minute, recap your comments about the initial stages of RAP that led to this, if I understand correctly, 20% household food waste reduction?
Sure. All right, so Kathryn, would you like to go first and just talking about the first one, and then we'll pass it to Nicola to try to answer a couple of those.
Right, so I mean, one, I don't find $3 to $5 billion a terribly large amount of money, because I currently am running an organization where I think I spent $1.7 billion last year. So, we make choices about what we're spending money on. But that has really been one of the things that we have been focused on, and we think that when we are making policies that is taking food out of the waste stream, we are incentivizing the compost facility over the landfill. And my landfill costs, I honestly think that I support all the region for everyone else's lower landfill costs are horrifically high. And so to be cost competitive with Waste Management or Republic or Covanta is actually not that hard. Because I'm paying those folks about $140 to $200 a ton. And I'm moving a huge amount of waste out. So to be competitive with that number is not actually that hard. And so we are seeing that what the investment community that I've been talking to is saying is, I need to know you're going to keep doing it. I need to know that you're going to have product, and I need to know that you're not going to cancel it, more than they need the money. Because they can be cost competitive, they do, I think, have the opportunity to be in a much better position than, I have to say, the plastics or the paper. Paper is, don't get dependent on China. Let me just put it that way, because it is not a good place for us to be on some of the other waste streams. And so I think that there are opportunities, but this is where policy at the state level would really help me, even if it's not at a residential. If you just said that grocery stores over, 60,000 square feet had to do it, it would make a difference in terms of people being willing to invest in the infrastructure to make it happen.
All right, so down at the end, I don't know if you want to, Nicola, talk a little bit about the two other questions, and then maybe if others want to comment also on reduce, and I think the point about keeping food up the hierarchy as much as possible. So do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's probably just down to terminology, and there's a lot of confusion around definitions of terminology in food waste. So when I was talking about what we call in the UK prevention, so when you think back to the hierarchy, most of our work that I've just discussed this morning is about trying to stop food becoming waste in the first place. So this is about food that's been eaten rather than gone to waste. By waste, I mean sent to AD, incineration or landfill, so the lower part of the hierarchy. We talk about surplus food redistribution. That's just the words we use in the UK when you're talking about recovery, and I've been picking that up. And we would class that as a prevention exercise, so it all comes under that top part of the hierarchy of prevention, and that's what our voluntary approaches are trying to address. There's lots of work further down the hierarchy to encourage when we do have unavoidable food waste, so food waste that, like, bones, skins, things like that, that wouldn't have been eaten anyway. We want that to go to AD as the most environmentally friendly way of disposal. So there's quite a lot of work in the UK to encourage more separate food waste collection from households and businesses, so it can then go to AD rather than lower down the hierarchy. Is that answer? Yeah. Okay. And on the work of RAP, I just double checked my statistics. Yeah. So it's an 18% reduction in the total amount of food that could have been eaten. So this is going back to the difference between edible and inedible food waste. We've actually recently just published our baseline for 2015. So if you're interested, that's on our RAP website. There's a booklet all about that. And that we've done some extra work as well to develop that baseline to classify what we think of as edible and inedible in the UK, because clearly that can be a cultural thing. So we've gone through and reclassified what edible waste is and what inedible waste is from households.
So I know there's probably more questions, but we're running a few minutes late. I think we're still going to be fine. But I want to just, as a wrap up, ask each of you briefly, very, quick fire round, lightning round, whatever it is. Just if we're back here again in 2 years, or hopefully someone else will host in 2 years and we'll be partying somewhere else, the plug for that. What would you like to be able to say? What's one thing you're working on right now that you would really, it can be realistic or not, but what would be one thing 2 years from now you'd be really excited to say happened in the work that you're doing?
That New York City passed mandatory source separation of organics for all residents.
Yeah.
Yours may be quick.
Yeah.
Hopefully our food donation bill will have been passed into law, and we'll start to see the fruit out of that. And I'm very hopeful that we can do something on the date labeling piece, and really excited to work on that. But I think overall, the way I look at everything is we need to make our system more efficient and effective. Like, we have food that can feed people who aren't being fed now. So how do we make that happen? And then how do we do the other piece of, diverting at all ways along the path to make sure it's not ending up in our solid waste system? So that entire system piece is where I want to keep looking at and figuring out how do we do a better job.
I'll echo the federal standard for date labeling. I would love to be able to say that we have one in 2 years. And then an actionable item for everyone, we'd love to really increase membership of the House Food Waste Caucus. So if you would like to reach out to your member to join, that would be very helpful and appreciated.
I think for me in the UK, in 2 years' time, we'll have an update on how we're getting on to prevent food waste to meet our 2025 targets. So I'm really hoping we've made some good reductions.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking this great panel and all their hard work that they're doing. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, and we'll release you to your day. So thank you. We'll see you back here at the end of the day, if not before.